This time on combat ships, amphibious warfare from the beaches of Normandy.
World War II was an armored war, and to fight it, you had to get tanks ashore onto a defended beach. It's an extraordinarily difficult thing to do.
To the jungles of Vietnam.
Most of the time, you're within 100, 200 yards of the shore. An enemy hiding in that jungle is able to start rocketing or machine gunning your boat.
Specialized craft took the fight to the enemy.
You could take them over rice paddies, over dikes 3 feet tall, right onto the river, back onto the land. No other vehicle in Vietnam could do that.
Fighting in the shallows and driving the point of the spear into hostile territory. Combat ships. Fast, effective.
The mission is pure James Bond espionage.
Deadly.
Japan is willing to throw the dice to engage just about every aspect of their military force in a climactic, decisive battle to stop the United States.
They have changed the world.
Warships have been key factors in global history, from the beginning of civilization to the present day.
Thanks to clever design, raw firepower, and the heroism of their crews. June 4th, 1944, 2 days before D-Day. On the south coast of England, over 130,000 troops, 50,000 tanks, trucks, and jeeps piled onto 4,000 landing craft. The next day, those ships set off into the English Channel, bound for the French coast.
The channel was rough on the 5th and 6th of June in 1944, and men were throwing up onto their boot tops and hoping to God that they lived long enough to get to the beach.
They were en route to the greatest amphibious assault the world had ever seen.
One day, you've got to throw ashore a big enough force to be able to take on the German divisions already deployed ashore. And not only have you got to put the soldiers ashore, you've got to put the engineers and the artillery and the tanks and the whole works.
To crack Hitler's Atlantic defenses, they needed specialized combat ships. Amphibious craft that could deliver the huge Allied fighting force onto the beaches of Normandy.
They built this terrific range of landing craft, small ones for carrying infantry, bigger ones for carrying tanks.
One of the largest was a British-built LCT, or landing craft tank. Inside a huge naval dockyard hangar in Portsmouth, England, is the last remaining LCT from the D-Day landings. Returning to its former glory, LCT 7074.
There were 7,000 ships and vessels all told in the D-Day landings. 800 of them were giant tank landing craft like this one. And of all of those 800, this is the last survivor. We are incredibly lucky to have her. She wasn't built to last very long, but somehow she survived to today.
After the war, LCT 7074 took an unlikely role as a floating nightclub in Liverpool. In 2007, she sank and was left to decay, until the National Museum of the Royal Navy raised millions of dollars to pull the 200-ton craft from the water.
She'd been underwater for about 7 years. There was a tremendous amount of suction built up between the ship and the seabed. So what we did was we filled her full of airbags, giant airbags, and as we inflated those airbags, we used a crane to, and the best way I can describe it is to jiggle the ship, to break that suction with the seabed and steady her, and then the airbags provided the lift that brought her up.
The years under the water left 7074 in bad shape. The team had to move quickly to save it. Now they are restoring the LCT to the condition she was in on D-Day. Early morning, June 6th, 1944. Allied warships opened fire on entrenched German positions. Under their cover, the first landing craft reached the Normandy beaches. 20-year-old Walter Sharp was piloting a sister ship of LCT 7074 towards Gold Beach.
By the daylight, we could see all these hundreds of other ships joining with us. Mind-boggling, really. See hundreds of ships there, all sizes, cargo ships and warships and all the landing craft. It was very spectacular.
Wave after wave of landing craft had to reach the beaches, unload their cargo, and then leave to make room for the next wave. All under intense enemy fire.
So they have a couple of anti-aircraft guns for defence, but essentially these ships are incredibly vulnerable. There's no armour except around the wheelhouse. They're incredibly slow. They only do about 8 knots. And they're driving into the beach in a straight line. They're a very predictable target. So it must have been absolutely terrifying for the crew.
Over 100 landing craft went down during the invasion. On D-Day, LCT 7074 carried a precious cargo of 7 Stuart light tanks, 2 Shermans, a Cromwell tank, and their crews. They'd need tanks to get off the beaches and move inland quickly.
So you have to imagine this ship on the 6th of June 1944. This space would be jam-packed, 10 tanks jammed in here. We'd be squeezing between 2 tanks. 60 or 70 soldiers, the crews of those tanks, they've been living in this space for the best part of 3 days. They've crossed the channel in it. The whole thing would have stunk of fuel oil and vomit and food. It would have been a ghastly, congested space.
Landing craft tanks had a shallow draft of just over 3 feet, allowing them to get close to the beach. But that also made them pitch and roll. Unfortunately for the soldiers, the sea on D-Day was choppy.
I think some of them were quite ill with that movement. But there's nothing they could do about it. They just had to bear up with it and do the best that they could. By the time they got to the beaches, they had other things to worry about. And they just went ahead.
Even as LCT 7074 hit Gold Beach, a landing craft next to her was sunk by enemy artillery. She pushed forward onto the beach with her precious cargo of 10 tanks.
She drives in as fast as she can. These enormous hinges drop a huge steel ramp that slaps down on the beach. And as she runs in close, behind us, 2 giant watertight doors open, and those tanks start to gun their engines and run over the ramp one at a time, grinding into the sand and heading off to join the battle for Normandy. Because for all the noise that's going on today with the restoration, that's nothing compared to the sound of 10 tank engines revving up, and around them hundreds of other ships with hundreds of engines, gunfire, aircraft overhead. I can't begin to explain how noisy D-Day would have been.
With the tanks on shore, 7074 made way for the next wave of landing craft. including Walter Sharp.
It's something you'll never forget. There are hundreds of craft on the beach in a line right down to Sword Beach and down there. It's hard to describe to people. They see the pictures of the landing beaches, but it's a lot like when you're there. It's just unimaginable.
The scale of D-Day can only really be understood by standing on something this big and realising that there were 800 of them in Normandy, and then you suddenly realise just how vast that entire operation was.
By June 11th, 1944, the Allies had secured the beaches of Normandy. The march on Berlin had begun. LCTs and other landing craft continued to bring vital reinforcements and supplies across the channel. Over the next 10 months, 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies came ashore at Normandy. Once restored, LCT 7074 will serve as a striking reminder of the landing craft's significant contribution to victory.
Just standing on these decks, it sends a shiver down your spine that actually it's not a replica, it is the ship that drove ashore under fire on the beach and offloaded tanks and liberated Western Europe. I just find it incredible, actually.
2 decades after D-Day, American forces faced a very different enemy. Defeating it would require fresh tactics and a new fleet of assault combat ships. By the 1960s, the U.S. was strengthening its military presence in Vietnam. American troops were supporting South Vietnam's capitalist government in its fight against guerrilla forces backed by communist North Vietnam. They found themselves fighting an elusive enemy.
The Vietnam War is not your classic warfare where 2 armies meet on the battlefield and 1 army is defeated. It's an insurgent or a guerrilla type of warfare, and the United States is going to have to figure out ways to counter it.
The war was fought on land and at sea. But the U.S. Navy was not battling enemy warships. Instead, they focused on breaking up the enemy's supply routes. Their new weapon for this mission was a fast, small combat craft. The Swift Boat.
We had about 85 boats that patrolled all up and down the coast of Vietnam from about 4 or 5 different bases. And our job was to interdict the supplies that the North Vietnamese were sending to the south.
These patrol vessels were well armed.
We had 2 50 caliber machine guns up on top and a gun turret, if you will. Single 50 caliber machine gun mounted in the aft deck section there, aft the stern of the ship. Underneath that, they had an 81 millimeter mortar launcher.
They were also fast enough to intercept almost any enemy ships.
They could get up to 25, 26 knots. They were very fast, fairly maneuverable. They could get in and out of harm's way fairly quickly. That was a tremendous advantage.
In 1968, the North Vietnamese were using trawlers to ship supplies south to the battlefields. The U.S. sent the Swift boats to stop them.
After we took out several dozen of those vessels, the North Vietnamese decided that, well, it wasn't cost effective to do it that way.
The North Vietnamese adapted their tactics, taking most of the supplies over land down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This supply route led through the jungles of Laos and Cambodia.
And my hat is off to the North Vietnamese people. What a tremendous, tremendous logistics problem they solved on bicycle, on carts, and a truck now and then. But they moved everything 1,000 miles by Ho Chi Minh Trail down to the Delta area. And once they did that, then they came out on boats through the Delta to distribute their arms, materiel, and medicines.
Much of the population lived around the Delta. With few roads to speak of, the rivers and canals became the highways.
It's really important to patrol the rivers because this is how the Viet Cong are getting supplied from the North Vietnamese. And the North Vietnamese are, of course, getting supplied by the Chinese and by the Russians. And so there is a lot of material coming south to keep this insurgency going against the South Vietnamese governments and the United States. And so the rivers are absolutely critical.
The swift boats shifted their focus to the river systems. Other specialist craft joined them. Vessels like the smaller patrol boat, River, and monitors, which were slower moving, but even more heavily armed. This was the Brown Water Navy, named after the color of the rivers they patrolled.
The vast, reedy delta of the Mekong River where it flowed into the South China Sea. Those various branches intertwined one with another and canals that connected them back and forth. And the reeds that grew so high, visibility was quite limited. Very confusing kind of battlefield.
It was like fighting in a maze.
A typical patrol is around 24 to 36 hours. We get underway and we'll run as hard as we can to get to the patrol area. Our patrol was day and night. There's 1 million boats out there, all junks, sampans, different sizes.
The narrow rivers meant a constant threat of ambush.
When we went up the rivers, it got a little dicey, and that's when you start to worry about everything.
Most of the time, you're within 100, 200 yards of the shore, and with thick jungle on the shore, then an enemy hiding in that jungle is able to start rocketing or machine gunning your boat.
The swift boat crews fired back with their 50 cal machine guns, laying down an impressive curtain of bullets.
The exciting times, of course, is when there's tracers in the air. When a machine gun shoots, every 5 rounds is a tracer round, that it actually leaves a red trail in the case of American ammo, so you can see where your rounds are going. And if it's green, it means it's coming at you. Green doesn't mean go, green means duck.
Often they were called in to cover their comrades on shore.
Every night, without fail, in most areas, you're getting calls from the beach, help, help, help. Guys are being attacked, and they want gunfire support. We have an excellent aftermount that can provide anywhere from just illumination to actual putting in high explosive or white phosphorus Willie Pete rounds.
These incendiary munitions, fired by the Swift's mortar, could clear an area or produce a huge smokescreen, providing cover for the troops on land. One of the most famous swift boat commanders was former Secretary of State John Kerry.
John Kerry, I think, was pretty representative of what most swift boats were doing in Vietnam. So a lot of patrolling, coming to the aid of other troops, especially with machine guns, quite a bit of engagement with the enemy as you get into these close quarters. Viet Cong are setting up ambushes a lot of the time.
In February 1969, Kerry and his crew were ambushed. A rocket-propelled grenade exploded close to their boat. Kerry gave the order to charge and take out the shooter before he could fire again. the boat hit the shore. The Viet Cong fighter, weapon in hand, turned and ran. Carey pursued him, determined not to let the enemy take another shot at his crew. He fired his M16 and took out the Viet Cong fighter. Carey and his men then returned to their swift boat and continued fighting the enemy ashore. For his leadership and actions on that day, John Carey was awarded a Silver Star. During his service on swift boats, he would also receive 3 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star. The Brown Water Navy accomplished its mission, blocking the critical supply arteries in the waters of South Vietnam. But of the 3,500 sailors who served on swift boats, 50 never returned home.
Honor, courage, and commitment. I think that's part of our legacy. Hold on a minute. And our dedication to the people we left behind. They're the real heroes. And we refer to them as still on patrol.
The boats of the Brown Water Navy were good at navigating the Mekong Delta. But in Vietnam, there were some places even swift boats couldn't go. Vietnam's unique wetland environment meant some areas were inaccessible to traditional boats and vehicles. The U.S. Navy hoped a new combat craft could solve this problem. In a boneyard behind the Yanks Air Museum in Chino, California, hundreds of old aircraft await restoration. In between the supersonic jets and World War II bombers are the remains of a unique craft. Father and son Tom and Tim Como, both retired Navy veterans, search for this American combat icon.
There she be.
She's seen better days. This would be the right side pannier decking.
This is the last surviving example of an experimental combat vessel.
That's the business end. How many times did you sit in that?
Quite a few.
Repair bullet holes and keep the thing flying.
This was once America's first combat hovercraft. British designer Christopher Cockerell invented the hovercraft in the 1950s. A machine that could travel over both land and water on a cushion of air. In 1963, the American aircraft manufacturer Bell purchased Cockerell's latest model and adapted it for military use, creating the Patrol Air Cushion Vehicle, or PAC-V. In 1966, the U.S. Navy sent 3 PAC-Vs to Vietnam for trials.
The reason they ordered them from the British was because of their ability to go anywhere they wanted in South Vietnam, through the marshes, through reeds, through small trees, up rivers, down streets. They could go wherever they wanted. There was no restriction. You can't do that with a tank. A tank is great for land. You can't do that with a truck, good for land. A boat, only on the river. Helos, only in the air. So this thing could go anywhere, anytime.
The hovercraft could do all this thanks to its ingenious design. A fan blows air underneath the vehicle, where it is trapped inside a rubber skirt. As the power increases, the volume and pressure also increase, filling the skirt and lifting the hovercraft off the ground. As air escapes under the edge of the skirt, the craft literally floats on air. Propellers then push it forward. With almost no friction between hovercraft and the water, it's very fast.
Craft was listed at 60 miles an hour, roughly, and it was the fastest craft in the riverine force, far exceeding all of the other surface craft. So it was very fast.
Powered by jet engine, PAC-Vs were loud.
Very noisy inside the cabin because you're very close to the jet engine, and it's always operating at peak performance. Plus, you've got the added discomfort of a few cannons going off a few feet above your head.
Tom was a maintenance officer on the PAC-Vs from 1967 to 1968, conducting missions in Vietnam.
They were experimental craft, and as such they were used in a variety of operations, from insertion of troops, quick insertions, retrieval, extractions, frontal assault, rear actions, reconnaissance. We even had medevac, where we take wounded people back. They were pretty versatile.
The noise from their jet engines and their intimidating look led the Viet Cong to give the PAC-Vs a nickname.
The craft were known as Quai Vat, which in Vietnamese means monster. That speaks to how they reacted to the sight of these things, which had the front end of each of the craft painted with large jaws full of shark's teeth and two big eyes. And it was kind of a startling sight.
The PAC-Vs carried a twin 50 cal machine gun in a swivel mount, situated above the cabin. An M60 machine gun was also mounted on either side of the hovercraft. But to hover, the PAC-Vs had to remain light.
The only armor we had on the PAC-V was to protect the engine and the gearbox. We had armor plating. The rest of it was constructed of 30 thousandths aluminum. It's like an aircraft. You could lean on it with a screwdriver and it would go through. So it was not much in the way of protection. We relied mainly on our speed to escape being shot at.
I see what looks like bullet holes.
Oh, that could be.
These two here for sure are bullet holes. They weren't important enough to patch.
That's right.
The incredible noise of the PAC-Vs meant the enemy knew they were coming. A sneak attack was impossible, but for a full-on assault, they were perfect. In late 1966, the PAC-V hovercraft showed their full amphibious combat capability. The plain of reeds in the Mekong Delta had long been a Viet Cong stronghold. This 2,000 square mile marshland was the ideal guerrilla hideout, inaccessible to boats and land vehicles. But not the PAC-Vs. In November 1966, they stormed the plain of reeds.
The PAC-Vs would often work in conjunction with the helicopters, in that the helicopter would be used as a forward observing entity and then radio back and vector in the PAC-Vs to intercept the Viet Cong. They couldn't hide anymore and run across a rice paddy and get away from a jeep or a group of guys. The PAC-Vs could just go right after them.
The operation lasted 16 days. The PAC-Vs were credited with destroying 70 enemy structures, 70 more sampans, capturing 11 Viet Cong fighters, and killing 23. the Navy commander in charge of the operation, was used to missions at sea and noted,
"It was an unusual experience directing the PAC-V operations in rice paddies. I couldn't help feeling a little funny about being 60 miles inland."
Despite the success, the Navy decided not to expand the program.
The PAC-Vs in their role were very successful. Getting the job done. It's just keeping the craft online was the problem. In those environments, they just didn't last.
In the combat area, you're constantly on the move, so your parts supply, you're very handicapped that way as far as trying to get parts and replacement parts for repairs, which were continuous, of course, because we had damage all the time.
The $1 million price tag didn't help. After 4,500 hours of operation, the Navy PAC-Vs left Vietnam in 1970.
It's sad when it's the only one left.
Yeah.
To see it in this condition. I hope they put it back together properly.
After hearing all the stories from you from Vietnam, and this is the real, this is the real deal right in front of me.
Yeah.
Worth $1 million. It's in a sorry state of disrepair, but it's here. It still exists. It's a unique part of naval history.
Yeah.
The concept of hovercraft as combat vessels did not die with the PAC-Vs. A new amphibious machine would rise from its ashes. In the early 1970s, the U.S. Navy began developing a new combat hovercraft. They drew on knowledge from the recently retired PAC-Vs, but gave these hovercraft a different purpose.
The main impact of hovercraft on naval warfare was in landing operations, because something that could operate over both the sea and the land was a vitally important way of getting a force ashore.
Especially for the U.S. Marine Corps. Today, its Marines can be delivered quickly to hostile beaches by Osprey, helicopter, or AAVs. They move fast, but travel light. In order to hold the beach, they need heavy reinforcements and fast. For this, there's nothing better than the landing craft air cushion, the LCAC. Today, the U.S. Navy has 72 LCACs. Half of them are at Camp Pendleton, California. Modern conventional landing craft, similar in looks to those used on D-Day, can hit just 15% of the world's beaches. LCACs can land on 70%. Their motto, no beach out of reach. They launch out of huge amphibious assault ships stationed out at sea.
In an amphibious assault, the Marines would go in there first, secure the beach, and then we would support them by transporting cargo from the ship to shore so that they can continue the fight and continue pressing forward.
And they do this fast.
We have the capability of reaching speeds up to 50 knots on the water.
Carrying payloads like the 60-ton M1 Abrams tank takes a lot of muscle. The LCAC's 4 engines give it an impressive 17,600 horsepower.
They work together to not only drive the plant and create propulsion for the propellers, but they also support the air that is created to raise up the LCAC and bring us on cushion so that we can operate on land and on water.
They are the ideal amphibious transporter. LCACs can launch from 370 kilometers out, well beyond the horizon, making it harder for the enemy to predict the time and place of their landing.
So this is the starboard cabin. This is where the main crew members sit.
With no friction between the craft and the surface, the LCACs are difficult to handle.
You can imagine this as an air hockey puck. It elevates on the ground. By the controls that I input, I have to manipulate it. It always wants to go to the lowest point. Wind plays a factor, so it is a stressful job, but my crew comes together to get things accomplished.
Today, Antony's team are practicing what's known as shallow beach landings. Swinging the LCAC around quickly by 90 degrees the moment they hit the beach allows vehicles to disembark on land no wider than the LCAC itself. On D-Day in Normandy, some landing craft had to wait hours till the tide was right to pull back and leave the beach. For the LCACs, landing, unloading, and returning to the water takes no more than 10 minutes.
All right, so this is a perfect landing. We're perpendicular to the beach. We've got the water to our right, so if it's a shallow beach, we can offload the vehicles, come back up, and proceed out to the beach wet.
If the beach has been hit by chemical, biological, or radiological weapons, known as a CBR attack, the LCAC has a clever trick up its sleeve: the bird bath.
In case we have a CBR attack, we're able to kind of sanitize the boat before going back to a naval vessel. We're just gonna 360 and it'll create a huge mist of water that washes down the boat.
The Hovercraft, the ultimate amphibious vessel, will be part of the U.S. Navy for decades to come. But no amphibious assault is possible if the coastal waters are filled with enemy forces. In the future, the U.S. Navy will turn to a new type of combat ship to solve this problem. No one knows exactly what future naval battles will look like. Today, the U.S. Navy must anticipate potential adversaries and the combat ships they might need to fight them.
With the end of the Cold War, there was much discussion in maritime strategic circles about the importance of the littoral, the area close to the coast, both land and sea. And a group of American officers decided that a special class of warship, high-speed warship, should be developed for operations in the littoral in a range of roles.
And so the Littoral Combat Ship, or LCS, was born. It's a small, fast warship, specializing in operations close to shore. 2 designs were submitted. Impressed equally by each, the U.S. Navy decided to order both variants. The Independence class and the Freedom class. These ships have the ability to adapt to any mission. They can carry a range of drones, smaller craft, and other combat machines, and can mount an array of different weapons. Both Freedom and Independence LCSs use helicopters to carry out key missions. both manned like the Seahawk and unmanned like the Fire Scout.
So the Navy came out with a set of requirements, and they wanted to have a ship that was very fast, but also very flexible, to be able to handle 3 different mission sets.
These aim to eliminate different threats. The first, small and silent submarines. The LCS's sonar detects them, then helicopter-launched torpedoes take them out. The second, small and fast surface craft. The LCS's array of gun and missiles destroy these. And third, mines. The LCS can deploy unmanned vehicles to locate and disable them. Eliminating these threats clears the way for larger combat ships, or an amphibious assault force. The 2 LCSs have radically different designs. Both bring unique combat ability to the battlefield. In Mobile, Alabama, Austal USA are building the Independence-class LCS.
So it takes us about 3 years to build one of these ships. And we build them in 3 phases of construction. We have modular manufacturing, final assembly, and then vessel completion. Once the modules are completed, they're tested, and they're inspected, then they come over to one of 2 assembly bays where we put the modules together like Lego pieces, and then they turn into the ship.
The distinctive shape of the Independence class gives it impressive speed.
So these ships actually travel in excess of 40 knots, which is very fast for a ship that's 127 meters. And the reason why it's able to do that is because of the trimaran hull form. The trimaran consists of a long, slender centerline hull that's also supported by 2 other hulls outboard of each other that gives the slender hull stability, but it reduces the drag in the water and allows you to go fast with relatively low horsepower.
The 3 hulls also give the vessel a wide, stable body.
This ship has actually the largest flight deck of any surface combatant in the Navy because of the fact it's so wide. It can actually operate 2 helos at once, which is the only ship in the surface Navy that can do that.
Beneath the flight deck, a large mission bay can transport additional vehicles.
This ship actually has what's called a twin boom extendable crane that can actually extend out over the water on the stern and launch and recover both manned and unmanned either surface or subsurface vessels. So that enables the Navy to launch and recover mission packages to do all sorts of various stuff.
The Freedom-class LCS, designed by Lockheed Martin and built in Wisconsin, looks very different. It has a semi-planing hull design. This means that as the ship speeds up, the hull lifts out of the water, increasing speed and maneuverability. This makes it ideal for congested choke points like the Strait of Hormuz in the Middle East. Here for the past decade, small, fast Iranian attack boats have harassed U.S. warships.
5 unidentified small surface contacts inbound. You're approaching rolling warship operating in international waters. Request your salvage communications. Identify yourself and state your intentions. Over.
In a full-scale military conflict, Iran could use huge swarms of these fast attack boats to overwhelm the U.S. fleet. Freedom-class ships would take these out, using either 2 30mm guns or Hellfire missiles. Both the Freedom and Independence class can also rely on the same formidable built-in weapon.
So this is the Mark 110 57mm Bofors gun. She's the main battery on board USS Freedom here on LCS-1. This gun is capable of fighting against fast attack craft as well as air contacts. She shoots 220 rounds per minute She holds 120 rounds up inside of herself at the ready, and each round carries 2,400 tungsten pellets.
When the shell bursts, these pellets made of extremely hard metal deliver a deadly shotgun effect, ideal against both sea and air targets. 21 LCSs are already stationed in California and Florida. With a total of 35 planned, these versatile combat ships are a key asset for the U.S. Navy of tomorrow. Whatever the future of naval warfare, the need for effective amphibious assault vessels will remain. They have the toughest job in naval warfare, charging into hostile territory and taking the fight to the enemy.